some of the goals that Starmer set for himself were always going to be very difficult to achieve. And this is one of the problems, actually, with the deliverism thing, is it if you set goals which you don't achieve, then the deliverism model breaks down because your opponents say, look, you're incompetent, you can't achieve it.
And Rishi Sunak and waiting list. It's all about Labour and kind of being able to pledge that we are going to deliver.
Before you watch today's episode, we want to remind you that tickets are on sale for the newsagent's live shows with HSBC UK. We're kicking off our tour at Birmingham Symphony Hall on February the 17th. Then we're off to the Bridgewater Hall in Manchester, that's on February the 24th. And finally to Usher Hall in Edinburgh on March the 11th. Head over to Global Player to get your tickets for any of those dates. The link will be in the description below. We're really excited to see you there.
Tomorrow, Keir Starmer is going to make a speech. I know, big deal, I hear you say. He makes a speech every bloody day. Well, no, not like this one. This is a big speech. It's even being called a reset, a relaunch. The Tories aren't impressed.
Mr. Speaker, the fact is the Prime Minister has discarded his own Labour leadership promises. He's dropped the 5 missions he said would define his government. He's ditched his pledge to make Britain the fastest growing economy in the G7. We left office with UK the fastest growing economy in the G7. And business is saying he has damaged the economy with his budget. Tomorrow he's going to have an emergency reset, Mr. Speaker, just 5 months into his premiership. But why should anyone believe a word he says?
So why on earth does the government feel it needs a relaunch after just 5 months in power? Welcome to the newsagents.
It's John.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
And our tickets have now gone on sale for 3 more performances in the new year. We're going to go to Birmingham on the 17th of February. We are going to be in Manchester on the 24th of February. And on the 11th of March, we will be at the Usher Hall in Edinburgh. Come along. We'd love to see you. And the tickets are available right now on Global Player.
And come on, Brommies, we'll get Birmingham to sell out first. As their native son returns,
the hero, the return of their
yes,
hero,
the prodigal son.
The prodigal
exactly.
son.
So we just, all right, yeah.
Anyway, look, go to Global Player where you will find tickets on sale. You can also find merch for Christmas presents, hoodies and tops and that sort of stuff with the newsagents on it. And who wouldn't want to open that on Christmas Day, eh?
Well,
yes.
Let's go on with the news, right, before we feel any more
okay.
filthy with all this stuff. We're talking about Keir Starmer and the fact that he is relaunching his government on Thursday, which was referenced, as you heard, by Kemi Badenoch in Prime Minister's Questions today. We thought we'd talk about it today, given it is such a newsy week, and sort of ask the question why it might be that Starmer, only 5.5 months into his government, is feeling the need to... It's not being officially billed as a relaunch, but to be honest, it is being briefed to the lobby journalists and so on as a kind of opportunity to really flesh out what his government is going to be about. We heard a lot about his missions, and now he's going to be, in a very Sunakian style, setting targets, realisable, achievable targets that Starmer wants to achieve with his government. And the really interesting thing about this, you might think that's quite familiar, Labour in particular love targets in government, but the interesting thing about it is that underpinning it all is a kind of theory of the case, a kind of theory of government, which is largely flowing from Morgan McSweeney, the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, which is they, particularly since the restoration and re-election of Donald Trump, they are particularly concerned about the possibility of a populist politics being led by a reform, sweeping away all before it over the next few years, and not just winning the next election or doing really well at the next election, but kind of like mutating where politics is going to go. And Morgan McSweeney believes, and we can talk about this because it's interesting, Morgan McSweeney believes that if Labour and the government can just show kind of demonstrable change in people's lives, if it can show rather than just tell, that will be the thing that neutralises populism in Britain.
Well, it was really interesting. Yeah, we were at the Spectator Parliamentary Awards last night, and they have a sort of list of slightly tongue-in-cheek awards, and one of them was for Newcomer of the Year, Parliamentary Newcomer of the Year. And I turned to the person next to me and I said, that's going to go to Nigel Farage.
I said the same.
And they said, no, he's not a newcomer, he's not a newcomer. And I said, yeah, that's the gag. He lost 7 times, now he's won, he's the newcomer in Parliament. And sure enough, Nigel Farage gets up to accept the Newcomer of the Year award. And it was quite interesting. There's a smattering of applause, and it's always a moment where you're trying to work out if the room is ecumenical. You know, has everyone met, irrespective of their party and their policies and their differences, to say, you know, let's celebrate sort of politics or parliament or government or, you know, journalism or whatever. It's a sort of meeting of lots of, you know, the good and the great from all sorts of different arenas, I suppose.
It's also filled with self-deprecating humour about yourself, your own party.
Generally, it is.
It's kind of, there's a lightness of tone.
I mean,
From
we
Nigel
can go on
Farage.
to some of Wes Streeting, who was doing the sort of the stand-up bit at the beginning later.
But from Nigel Farage,
so
not
Nigel
so much.
Farage, and they played, they played the Trump music. You know, proud to be an American. And up he walks on the stage, and he said, "Well, thank you. It's lovely to be the newcomer. I'm just telling you that at the next election, there will be hundreds of newcomers, and there will be reform newcomers, and we will be forming the next government." And he sat down, and the room went utterly silent. And it was a sort of dual moment, I think, where people heard what he said and believed what he said, but no one was clapping. And that was the moment when I suddenly realised, as we talked about a little bit on the show yesterday, that Labour and the Conservatives have sort of come together.
And no one was laughing.
Yeah, exactly that. That was what was so interesting about it. The mood changes like that on a sixpence.
The balloon's
it turns.
burst, yeah.
Yeah, the balloon has burst.
But we were left thinking about it. I think everyone, you know, you caught people's eye around the room and everyone went, that's entirely possible.
And you realise that the efforts that are being made now, and we talked about this a bit on the podcast yesterday when we were talking about kind of Elon Musk and his potential involvement in the reform project. You know, 4 million votes at the last election. They are building up an infrastructure just like the Liberal Democrats have done, so that they have got a machine that is ready to go. So that was Farage last night. So tomorrow, it's all about Labour and kind of being able to pledge that we are going to deliver. And I guess in the Morgan McSweeney theory that you were just outlining, Lewis, the most important part of that is immigration and dealing with the small boats and, you know, kind of having a better story to tell than the Tories did.
It's that, but it's also kind of smaller and more micro than that in a way, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way. It just is. So McSweeney believes that in order for, you know, quote unquote social democratic parties, centre left parties, to survive in this age of kind of fire and brimstone politics, when there are all of these kind of political actors which are telling these very stories which are full of invective and seeking to divide, and where in particular centre left parties have struggled to retain their older, more socially conservative voters. That's not just a British phenomenon. It's happened all around the world. The way to arrest that decline is by showing even quite micro improvements in kind of local areas. I mean, he talks loads to MPs. We talked about this when we did this profile of him on the show. You know, he talks loads about sort of potholes and sort of really hyper-local issues. So you can kind of point to government and say, look, government works. The democratic institutions as we know them, which are run and operated by kind of normal mainstream politicians, can deliver for you, right? That's the theory of the case. The question is whether actually in 2024 and running up to 2028, 2029, that is the case. Because of course there is someone else who kind of like had that theory, right? And what was his name? It was Joe Biden. That was precisely Joe Biden's theory as well, and that is why
delivery.
Deliverism. Yeah, that is why they were so radical in those early years when they controlled Congress and they had all the levers, the Democrats in power, and they spent so much money in the Inflation Reduction Act, because they thought that if they could show that government was working and reindustrializing and all that, they win. And guess what?
They didn't.
They didn't win.
Yeah.
That's the question. Like, what would you have to do if you're a centre-left party? Do you shut down all immigration and stop it entirely? Because you can guarantee that the problem is that when you're opposite these populist forces, they will always move the goalpost because they believe in it more than you. They would then say, we were talking about this earlier, I remember before coming on the show, it's like, you can imagine if Labour stopped all immigration tomorrow, which obviously they would never do, but in some hypothetical world they do. You can imagine Farage then turning around and saying, well, fine, but what about the millions of people already here? Why aren't you deporting them like Trump?
Well, if you want to compare it to Trump, who has said we're going to round up and deport up to 11 million migrants, you're never going to beat Trump at his own game in terms of words. I don't think Trump will do that for a minute.
No.
But I think he'll probably say that he has.
Yeah.
And so then you're stuck with, what does a Labour government have to do to show that it has A, understood the concerns, and B, done something about the concerns, and how far does that go, right?
Sure, exactly. But Lewis, you asked me the question about what do you need to do to make it look like success? And you talked about the US context of it. I always used to sort of kind of, when politicians would blame the messenger and say, well, the policy was right, we just didn't communicate it very well. Actually, I think now more than ever, it is vital to be able to tell a story of what you're doing and how you're winning and convince the British people or the American people that you're doing the right things. Joe Biden did a lot of things where he did deliver on policy. And, in certain places, they did communicate it very well. I mean, Michigan did disproportionately well as a state over the Biden years because they had politicians who were really good at talking about the local issues and saying we're dealing with it. I think that Biden failed because he couldn't tell a narrative. And also, inflation was stubbornly high and the economy, people's pocketbooks were empty.
Yeah, what I would say is that, and sorry to sound like, the crack record on this, but you are playing an asymmetric kind of warfare because populists will always deal in something that is not necessarily related to fact. And mainstream parties still feel like they have to be adhering to a fact-based order of what they've done. And I think that is a fundamental difference here. So the Organisation for Cooperation and Development, right, is saying that UK inflation will surpass previous forecasts next year, right? They're talking about headline inflation of 2.7% for next year, right? So whatever Keir Starmer does has to take into account things that bodies, organisations, independent sort of watchdogs are saying to him. If you come at it from Reform, or if you come at it from MAGA, or Jeremy Hunt, who actually did push back on figures from the OECD, and so suddenly you've got this dilemma. Are you a party that is going to adhere to international bodies, or are you a party that can quite happily say, oh, we don't really believe in experts enough?
I think part of this as well goes back to problems that Starmer and the government, the Labour opposition, set for themselves in opposition, right? And I mean, two things about that. Like, one is that Starmer, some of the goals that Starmer set for himself, actually, because this is going to be like adding sort of, even more realisable targets. Some of the goals and missions that were set were always going to be very difficult to achieve. And this is one of the problems, actually, with the deliverism thing, is if you set goals which you don't achieve, then the deliverism model breaks down because your opponents say, look, you're incompetent, you can't achieve it. And
Rishi Sunak and waiting lists.
Completely. And Starmer's entire pitch in so many ways has always been predicated on a kind of politics of competence and a politics of being able to kind of manage the institutions better than his opponents. So, for example, when he promised to deliver the fastest sustained growth in the G7, this is crazy.
That's a nutcase.
Crazy. The US...
How can you have any control over that or what the other economies are doing?
And also, the G7 includes the United States, which has always, historically, since the war, nearly always had a stronger level of trend GDP economic growth than we do. That is just a fact because it's got a more dynamic economy. So you set yourself up to fail there. Other things, Ed Miliband promising, which I guarantee is going to come back and bite the government in the next few years, talking about reducing people's energy bills by £300 at a time because of the green transition, when the truth is quite a bit of the green transition is going to add to people's bills in one form or another, often for good reasons, but that is the case. So there is stuff around that. And I think then there is a wider problem, which is part of, I think, one of the reasons is they're going to end up this sort of semi-relaunch, which is that, look, what's the essay question been for this government from the start, and they knew this in opposition, it's how do you improve public services in an era of scarcity when there just is very little money around? And the truth, in order to do that, is you're probably going to have highly reforming government, harnessing technology, harnessing real innovation, a real reform agenda. And the question is, and the thing that I don't think this government has been, for all the talk of it being a shaky start and needing a relaunch, I don't think it has been that shaky. Yeah, there have been problems, there have been some political missteps, there's been a steep learning curve. The biggest problem for me about this government is none of that. The problem is the lack of deep, sustained thinking about how to achieve that essay question. Because even when you've got people like Wes Streeting, who on the face of it would be like the big sort of reformer of the government, the reform agenda on the NHS, there's a bit here, there's a bit there, there's not a lot. Same with education, same with elsewhere. If you compare it to the kind of high reforming days of the Blair period, for example, and I don't like to harp back to that all the time, but it is an interesting point of comparison. The sense of genuine, sustained thinking on reform, I think, is pretty shallow. And I think that is the biggest problem long term for this government.
I was speaking to one of the kind of senior parliamentarians at this awards thing last night, and he was saying the problem is that Labour hasn't decided itself what it is.
Correct.
It has not decided itself whether it is a major reforming government in the model that Blair tried to be, or whether it is an old-fashioned kind of, almost like a Callaghan government, tax and spend.
It's more
right
like
wing.
that right now than it is the Blair. If you had to,
completely. So it's not New Labour. This is old Labour, but on the right of Labour, which is a very different thing to New Labour. And I just think that Keir Starmer himself seems, it would be fascinating tomorrow to see whether we get any clearer indication of that, about what sort of government it is. But the kind of ideological underpinning, I'm not sure there is one.
Yeah, I also think the language is difficult, because when you've got Labour, and we don't, obviously we're ahead of the speech at this point, so let's see. But there's the kind of language that's coming out is about the dashboard, and I spoke to somebody who's from the SNP yesterday saying, can you imagine, if I was taking that back to my constituents in Glasgow council houses, in the estates, and they hear the word dashboard, they just want to deck you. Like, nobody understands that kind of language. It's just like, it's politicians' language at a time when people are desperate to hear very, very tangible things that are going to improve their life.
Vibes
and that's
as well. We're in a vibes-based politics. And that's, I think, the problem with Starmer. I think that's always been the question mark about Starmer, is like...
But this is why McSweeney's right. When he says potholes, like, I can tell you about the roads that have had their potholes filled in the last 5 months since Labour came to power. I know where they are. I drive along them and I go, this is a beautiful thing. And it's so tangible. It sounds crazy. It's so tangible that those are the things that massively improve, your quality of life and your car, right? Simple.
I think the other problem for Starmer is, again, another potential Biden one, which we saw at PMQs today, which is he's Mr. Rules, right? And that poses over a long period, if you don't adhere to it, a particular problem against populists, because they are particularly adept and adroit at exploiting that. I heard at PMQs today, Kemi Badenoch, which I thought, it's not that much by comparison, that much, but it was by far her most effective PMQs performance so far, pressing Starmer on whether or not what he knew that was new about the Transport Secretary, former Transport Secretary Lou Haig's resignation, or what he knew about these allegations which had come to light about the fact she had to resign, that she had to resign over a historic sort of fraud case. And he said that he wasn't going to reveal what he said. Just listen to this clip.
Mr. Speaker, he's obfuscating, but I'm going to keep him on the topic. He owes the House an explanation. He said that the former Transport Secretary was only asked to resign after further information came to light. What was that further information?
I'm not going to disclose private conversations. Further information came to light. The Justice Secretary resigned. As I say, what a marked contrast. Whilst she's obsessing with the Westminster issues, we're getting on with fixing the mess, fixing the foundations, that £22 billion black hole, our prisons bursting, Mr. Speaker, as we found out last week, nearly 1 million net migration numbers because of the Tory...
The problem he's got there is that he had in the cabinet a minister who had a fraud conviction. What we don't know, and she has said Keir Starmer was aware of it. So what is the new information that made Keir Starmer decide he had to let her go and accepted her resignation? Or was it that it was only when it became public that he decided he had to let her go? These are legitimate questions to be asking when you have posited yourself as Mr. Integrity, Mr. Straight Up, Mr. Rulebook.
The question it begs is, was she becoming slightly troublesome for him? So was this an easier out of something that he didn't want to confront? He would have fought harder, presumably, to keep somebody like Rachel Reeves.
And this is why I make the comparison with Biden, right? Because, obviously it's very, very different. But the comparison
this week
is problematic, is that when you set yourself up as the party of rules, and then you do not practice as you preach, as Biden did not with the Hunter Biden pardon, then it just basically, populists and forces, basically, it's their favourite thing to say. They say they are all the same. They are all the same. They preach this kind of language about democratic norms, whatever. They never, ever adhere to it. Okay. And obviously this is a small version of that, but you can imagine it recurring and recurring and recurring and becoming particularly problematic for Starmer.
I think that is actually a problem for us, because before you know where you've got, on your analogy, and I know obviously it's completely different for Starmer, you're basically saying, oh, Biden, what a terrible, terrible man that you pardoned your son. And somehow everything that Trump has done on the other side gets slightly forgotten in the kind of concentration on hypocrisy. And all I'm saying is, I think where Labour have got to do better, actually, is finding a response to all this stuff.
Yeah.
You know, they are doing...
Crisply.
Yes. I mean, they're doing the things that they said that they would do in power. If you look at what he's done on the world stage, if you look at what he's done at COP, if you look at the kind of approaches he's making at the G20, you know, the relationships he's building up with Xi, could he have done better in terms of saying, I'm going to work with the EU and Trump? No, that's all fine. What they're not doing is arguably just delivering it with any kind of confidence. I mean, it's almost that. It sort of feels like it lacks the force of confidence to say, trust me on this one, I've got it.
Well, it circles back to where we started, right? Which is I actually think that I think that probably the real riposte to it is it isn't enough just to show. I think you have to tell. In this age that we're in, where people have literally, you know, so much competition for their attention, and they're sort of news adjacent at the best of times, you have to be telling.
But isn't that the central dilemma of modern politics today? That here you have Starmer having the honesty to say, these are really complicated problems and they're not going to be solved overnight, and there's going to be some tough years, and he's hoping that things are turning around and getting right by the time he faces the British people in 2028 or 2029. But on the other hand, what do you say to the British people? Because Nigel Farage is filling in the gaps by saying they've let you down, they've betrayed you. Kemi Badenoch saying they've let you down, they've betrayed you, and that's really hard.
I was at a breakfast this morning with Angela Merkel, who's over here.
Hang on. What a name drop.
Yeah, I bet that was thrilling.
So, do you know what? It was really interesting because she was asked by the chief vaccine scientist how she'd gone from being a scientist, you know, she's a physicist, and Merkel's really interesting. She said, the reason I chose physics was because I was in Eastern Europe, in East Germany, and I wanted something that adhered to facts, that could not be pushed into opinions.
Even the Stasi couldn't change physics.
Even the Stasi couldn't change physics. So she's asked by the scientist, Sarah Gilbert, you know, how did you move from being a scientist to being a politician? Was that a complicated thing? And Angela Merkel just says, as a politician, I just had to keep repeating the same thing over and over again with a smile on my face. She said, as a scientist, you feel like you have to provide new things. You have to bring in new data. You have to bring in new discoveries. As a politician, you just keep on saying the same thing. And everyone laughed. And I was like, yeah, maybe that is it.
The ultimate anti-populist, Merkel.
Yeah, but also, I mean, think of that, right? Because Starmer is also going to be possibly much more lonely of this time tomorrow if Barnier, who is his kind of centrist buddy in the French Parliament, is suddenly toppled.
Well, Macron could be gone by 2027.
Macron could be
Le Pen
gone.
could be French president.
Yeah,
AFD,
so suddenly he's a much more, you know, you see what's happening in Germany. Yeah. He's a much more isolated figure than Blair ever was when he was Mr. EU, right?
No, exactly. Just before we finish on this section, because at The Spectator Parliamentarian of the Year Awards, there is a new editor of The Spectator, Michael Gove, and he did these introductory remarks. And he said, well, one of the prizes we haven't got is for the most modest and self-effacing of
Loudmouth of the Year.
Loudmouth of the Year. That would have gone to Lewis Goodall.
So we'd just like to award you that.
I'm sorry. Getting lectured by Michael Gove on modesty is like getting lectured by Greg Wallace on workplace etiquette. I mean, honestly, this is absolutely outrageous.
Greg Wallace is coming on tomorrow.
Right, okay.
We'll be back in a moment with what has been happening in Seoul, and it is bewildering. This time yesterday, we were just finishing recording our episode of the podcast, and we suddenly saw a flash that the president of Korea, President Yoon, had declared martial law in the country, and all democratic institutions were suspended. He and the military were in charge. Well, it seems now, 24 hours on, that there are limits to what a head of state can do if he doesn't have the consent of the people, because the people and the politicians in the assembly have fought back, and now it is the president who is in deep trouble. And forget martial law, he is facing impeachment and possible imprisonment.
Well, we're going to talk now to Carl Friedhoff, who is the Marshall M. Boughton Fellow for Asia Studies at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And Carl, Yesterday, President Yoon was invoking those emergency measures, saying that the opposition had harboured shameless pro-North Korean anti-state forces. I mean, I remember hearing that and thinking, what on earth is going on? That was just a lie, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think, the type of language that he's used that throughout his presidency. He used that as part of his campaign as well when he was running for president. But the reality is, in South Korea these days, that kind of language is really anachronistic. No one really thinks that way. Only the really hardcore right still think that there is a North Korean sympathizer movement within the Progressive Party. Young people don't really see it that way. No one in their 40s or 50s sees it that way. So it's kind of curious that he would use that language, because really what it does is, I think, it paints him as a leader who is incredibly out of touch with society. And so far, what we've seen from his policies, especially with the declaration of martial law, has shown that to be true. This is a leader who is largely out of touch, and he's been that way for some while. And so now, he's entered the find out portion of this program that we've seen this morning, that the National Assembly has tabled their impeachment bill, and there should be a vote coming up shortly. If the impeachment goes through, he, I think, and his wife, for that matter, are going to be in a very bad place once the personal investigations open up into their conduct while in and before office.
So it was a total miscalculation on his part, without any regard to whether he would announce this and the people would follow behind.
Yeah, it's very curious, because when I don't know if he's now the former defense minister at this point, or maybe he's still the current defense minister. In any case, he's not showing up in any of the photo ops that are ongoing as everyone tries to cover their butts from what has happened. But when they asked the defense minister at the National Assembly if there was any intention to declare martial law, this was, I think, in September of this year, he said, of course not, and the public would never accept such a declaration. So they knew going into this that the public was not going to be behind them. And that raises the question, if you know the public isn't going to be behind you and there's not going to be support for this, then why carry it out in the first place? And that's a question, I think, where we're all still looking for.
What did you think when you saw those scenes on the streets of Seoul yesterday? I mean, I'm saying protesters, but actually it was just the voters. It was members of the public who came out to say no thanks. What was going through your head at that time? At
first, I thought this was a start of a much larger movement, and that still may prove to be the case. We have to wait to see what is going to happen over the coming days. If the KTCU, that's the Korean Trade and Confederations Union, sorry, the acronyms get a little bit confusing at times for the labor unions. They've called for a general strike, and they've said that they're going to be out, I believe, in Seoul on December 5th, maybe the 7th, but in the coming days, and they have about 1 million members there. And so that is going to be something that, if they hit the streets, especially around the presidential office, you're going to get much more dramatic images than you saw in the previous days. I've been in and out of Korea for 15 years. I've been to a lot of the largest protests that they've ever had. And so I think we're at the beginning of another cycle of that. Just one thing about Korean civil society is that once they start a protest, they are very unlikely to give it up until they see results.
But I guess what is interesting about this, and I'm going to compare it to, I suppose, the kind of sort of power plays that we've seen in the United States over the past couple of years, is that even Yoon's own party were not prepared to let him get away with this. If you were looking for the Mitch McConnell figure, it held up yesterday in South Korea in a way it didn't against Trump on January the 6th.
Yeah, I think part of that goes back to the lived experience of many of the members of parliament and other voters. In living memory, they have overthrown a dictatorship that was in the 80s, and they have removed another president in 2017 that was corrupt. So they've had this experience, and there's a real belief that civil society and peaceful protest can play a role and is a vital part of political life.
So, Carl, what you're saying is, because we kind of woke up this morning and thought, okay, well, that was a brief 24-hour excitement, not exciting, let's go back, Korea is back to normal. You're saying there could still be more upheaval yet?
I am quite confident that there will still be more upheaval. Again, the KTCU is not a labor union that takes these things lightly. I saw someone announce you'll have to verify this, or I'll have to verify this later, that the rail operators were going to go on strike. For me, that is somewhat of a poorly thought out, perhaps, strike. Because if you want people to protest, they need transportation to get to where they're going. And so a rail strike would inevitably cut that down, as would a bus strike, obviously. But yes, I think this is the start of a cycle as the progressive parties heat up their calls for impeachment on the National Assembly floor and the labor unions come together. I would expect to see the images that are coming out of in and around the now Yongsan presidential office to be full of people and candlelight and to carry on for quite some time.
So we might be back to you for that. But before then, is Yoon still president? Is anyone else in charge now as the head of state?
No, Yoon is still the president, and now we're starting to look at potential successors, whether that's through the election, but if he is impeached, as I expect he will be, and then the question becomes, will the Constitutional Court remove him? There's some complications there. That if he is removed, then the prime minister would become acting president. But he's resigned in August, although the resignation was accepted, he still continued on. There's a lot of complications about who would potentially take over if he is impeached. But for now, yes, Yoon remains in power and has given little indication that he intends to resign.
Carl Friedhoff, great to talk to you. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
So later tonight, as we mentioned, there is a vote in the French Parliament which could bring down the new Prime Minister, Michel Barnier. He could be about to become the shortest-lived Prime Minister in France because a vote has been called by the left in Parliament that will be probably endorsed by the far right, the Marine Le Pens of this world. And if those two parts of the Parliament come together, they will see him off. The centre, as it were, will not hold.
And Michel Barnier was the sort of conservative voice of the centre-right who got appointed Prime Minister after the kind of disastrous move by Macron to have those legislative elections. And what you're getting is fantastically mixed messages, with Barnier saying this will be economically catastrophic if this budget does not get passed. And you've got Macron saying, yeah, no, the French economy is strong. There's no real problem here. And just the kind of distance between the two of them. And so actually Macron is emboldening in some ways the rebels on the right and the far left to vote it down because Macron is saying there's no big deal. The economy's fine.
This time tomorrow, the thing we'll be watching, indeed before, are what happens to European markets, what happens French stock exchange, what happens to the euro, what is happening in terms of the reaction from Brussels. Because there is a world, it is possible that maybe the markets take this in their stride and they take their French bond yields are not going out of control in terms of France being able to finance its considerable debt. There is a world where the markets are reasonably phlegmatic about it, though they think that another government will be appointed and so on. There is a world, as we discussed on the show when we did this issue in depth last week, which people should listen back to if they want more of a primer on it. There is a world where the markets do not take it in their stride and they start to spin out of control. They believe that France cannot sustain its considerable debt to GDP ratio. And if that happens, then all bets are off, because we are starting to talk a bit, which has been muttered darkly in Brussels and in central banks as well across the world, that we could be looking at another European sovereign debt crisis, but not with Greece or even Spain or a vaguely peripheral European economy, but France at the absolute heart of the EU.
I mean, interestingly, that could be the thing that stops Marine Le Pen in her tracks, because if she gets blamed, or if any part of this is then blamed on the Rassemblement National, her party, for creating economic chaos, then it makes it much harder for them to slip into a new world in which they become, a party of government. We should say that you cannot, under the French constitution, elect a brand new government until I think June of next year.
You can't have new elections,
You can't have new elections. All you'd get is basically a caretaker prime minister.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good contrast with what we were talking about before, right? With South Korea, which is basically, as ever, political elites. That's what really matters in any political system. Basically, in South Korea, you had a group of people from across different parties who still wanted the system to work. Frankly, right now, there is no sense in France that enough people within the French parliament, enough parties, have enough incentive to make the system keep working. And so you just end up with a fragmented political system and potentially chaos.
We will be watching very closely and we'll be reporting on it, I'm sure, tomorrow. Bye-bye.
See you then. Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.